Odysseus and his men sail to the edge of the world, into the endless darkness and the house of death. Following the ritual that Circe prescribed, Odysseus fills a trench with blood, and the shades of the dead come out to meet him. Odysseus first speaks to Elpenor, his comrade, who fell off the roof of Circe's house, and lays unburied back on Circe's island. Odysseus then sees his mother, who he did not know was dead, but first speaks to Tiresias, the famous Theban prophet. Tiresias warns Odysseus he will come upon the cattle of the sun god, and he is not to harm them. Moreover, if Odysseus does make it back home to Ithaca, he will have to leave his home again and go on a penitential journey to appease Poseidon. Odysseus then speaks to his mother about what is happening in Ithaca. He then sees a grand array of women, famous women from antiquity, sent by Persephone, queen of the underworld, to drink the blood and speak to him. Odysseus then speaks to Agamemnon, and then to Achilles. And then he tries to speak with Ajax, but Ajax refuses, blazing with anger at Odysseus. Odysseus then sees several figures from mythology and speaks to the hero Heracles, or Hercules, who compares his exploits to that of Odysseus's. The book ends with the shades of the dead overwhelming Odysseus, and he and his men run back to the ship in terror. All right. Welcome to Ascend the Great Books podcast. We are working through Book 11 of the Odyssey, the Kingdom of the Dead. Odysseus goes down into the house of the dead. Please follow us on Twitter or X or whatever I'm supposed to call it. Also visit our website where we have a whole library, including our question and answer guide to the Odyssey that can help you or your small group throughout this text. Today, we're very happy to have good guests again. Dr. Frank Grabowski is back with us, along with Thomas Lackey. How are you guys?
Well,
good.
Yeah, doing really well. You guys, again, to remind everyone, are also part of our Sunday Great Books group that comes together and meets over charcuterie boards, some good scotch. Well, I bring the scotch. I think that we usually have someone who's more refined than I am bring wine or port or something along those lines. And then we have a good conversation. I think there's a lot of camaraderie and fraternity that comes out of it as well. So Thomas, you, this is your first read through of the Odyssey?
Yeah, this is my first time.
Yeah. So how did you just what's your high level? What did you really enjoy about House of the Dead or this Kingdom of the Dead? Did it stand out to you at all?
Oh yeah, and this is my favorite book so far. And I mean, it's admittedly early to say, but I'm going to hold out a high possibility this will be my favorite book of the Odyssey, period. I think one thing to do is to kind of set the dramatic stage, and Homer does this so well. First, of course, Odysseus is telling this story after dinner. The hall is dark, all the rest. So you have this sort of perfect atmosphere for this sort of story. But there's also a very much a kind of liminal quality to everything he's doing. He's putting a tension. Imagine standing on the edge of a cliff and that tension you have. And we even use that term in drama all the time, like a cliffhanger and this sort of thing. Well, here, as we go through the text, we'll see, but he sets it beyond the river ocean. Well, the river ocean bounds the entire world, so he's crossing out of the world, where then he stands on the edge of the river. He's on the edge of Hades. He meets Elpenor, who kind of makes this kind of crux of standing at the edge of life and death. He's crossed into this isle that's at the edge of light and dark. Everything. He's taken every possible trope, every possible aspect of dramatic tension, and placed it all into one moment, and that's just the setup. So I think that's the first thing that really jumps out at me. I mean, we've got this, and I would say that it more or less stands at the sort of the turning point or the edge of the book. It's smack dab in the middle, and I think we see this is the point at which things, his journey starts to take a turn of its own. So I think it definitely stands out for sure.
Dr. Grabowski, you helped us a few episodes understand like some of the etymology, or not the etymology, but the actual Greek that's underneath some of these texts. And now like you're just in my head. So like when I was sitting here reading, and it like mentions like power, like a power came upon him. I'm like, oh, is that Damon? And I'm like, maybe I should text Dr. Grabowski right now and like, be
And
like,
it
what is?
was.
I'm trying not to completely be a nerd, but like read it. Like you've got me really kind of like thinking about these things. And some, because we talk about arete, we talk about guest friendship, zinnia, these kind of things. And now I'm kind of looking also for thumos, right? You've helped us with that as well, right? This like spiritedness, and then also the daemon, this power. I've been looking for that as well as we kind of go through the text. So, Dr. Grabowski, before we
as a tool, as a helpful tool for you and the listeners, I would say there are two in particular. One is a website called Perseus Project. And that it's really interesting because it not only has the texts in the Greek, but by clicking on the words in the Greek, it links you to a Greek dictionary. So it provides you, in a way, it's interlinear, where you have the Greek and you can look at the English. Another really good site it's called the Chicago Homer. And that has texts of both the Iliad and the Odyssey, and likewise, just like just like Perseus Project, it too will link you from the Greek text. And in fact, it has the Greek underneath the English translation, and I think they're using the Lattimore translation. So if you're ever curious about a word that's being used, I would say you can go to that. Now the line numbers are a little bit different between the Lattimore translation and the Fagles, but you can kind of work out where exactly in the Lattimore translation Fagles is translating. So those are two really good sites, I would say, that for anyone curious or interested in learning more of the Greek that Homer is implementing, I would say those are good places to go.
That's great. I appreciate you sharing that. That'll be very helpful because so many times I'm just sitting there thinking, and then if you do kind of look it up, sometimes it gives it to you in the Greek, but that doesn't have an English like transliteration, and I'm like trying to stare at all little symbols and be like, wait, is that the word I want it to be? And I'm like, yeah, this is not. I'm outside my ambit. This is not what I should be doing.
Yeah, no, you'll find it really, really helpful.
Good. Well, Dr. Grabowski, do you have, before we kind of dig into the text itself, any kind of preliminaries on Book 11?
Well, I agree with everything that Thomas has said, and for me, at any rate, the one question mark that has been hanging over the text ever since Book 9, I think, is the reliability of the narrator. Odysseus, after all, we know is polytropos, that he's a man of many twists and turns, that he's very crafty, and so I can't help but wonder how much of what we are hearing from Odysseus actually happened and how much of it is being used to curry favor from his audience. And I think we may get some clue by the brief little interlude in Book 11, where he pauses and then both Arete and Alcinous jump in only to say, oh, let's lavish gifts on Odysseus. We need to give him more of these gifts. And so to me, I can't help but suspect that there's more to the story than just Odysseus telling his tale, that perhaps he is seeking more kleos. That could be one of these underlying motivations. I don't know, Thomas, what you think about that.
Yeah, I'm pausing. I also wonder how much Alcinous, especially, you could read his comments, we'll get there later, but in two ways, right? Either he's simply praising Odysseus, or he's a bit tongue-in-cheek as well, saying that you've told the tale artfully, and I can tell you're no liar, and all these sorts of things that have, at best, you could a kind of double meaning, I think. And I think I think one way to read it is, and I don't know how much of that was true, but it sure was a great story. Go on, which I don't think is very far off.
So I don't want to cast too much doubt on the veracity of what Odysseus is saying, but I do think that this is one of the things that Homer is he wants us to keep in mind as we're listening, because it is very odd, just as we get into this, why Elpenor is the first person he meets. I mean, why would Odysseus? In other words, was he in fact the first person he meets, or did Odysseus want his audience to think that Elpenor was the first person that he met?
Well, I would also back up a little bit because I want to clarify what I'm saying. I'm not necessarily thinking that Alcinous is saying he's lying. I think Alcinous is picking up on something else that's not necessarily wrong, which is that there's many ways you could tell a story, the same story, and you often tailor it to your audience. And what I think he's noticing is, at the very least, that Odysseus has very well tailored this version of the story to the audience that he's in front of. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's false, but it doesn't mean you've gotten, as it were, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth presented to you.
Brilliant observation, Thomas, because I think maybe we'll get into the text here shortly, but is that not what Homer or what other rhapsodes or poets would do? We know that this is not a set-in-stone story. I mean, the themes, the characters, but as the poet would recite the story, there would presumably be variations depending upon the poet, depending upon the audience, depending upon when it was, where it was being recited, and so on. So I think that in a way, Homer may, this idea that you're presenting here is Homer channeling himself into Odysseus.
Oh yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's almost like a fourth wall kind of breaking thing with the commentary.
Let's dig into the actual text. So, as we mentioned, we talked about that he's down at the house of death, etc. He's done this ritual of which has several components, but mainly, pouring the blood into this trench. And I think that, which has already been mentioned, but I do want to see what you guys think about it, that Elpenor is the first one that comes forward. And there's a few things about this, maybe just to open it up, that really caught my attention. One is that I thought it was really fascinating that a lot of people who read this in some commentaries think that Odysseus doesn't know that Elpenor is dead. That like he's just now realizing for the first time, like, oh my gosh, Elpenor, you're dead. Like, how did you become dead? He's like, oh, I fell off the roof and you guys left me. And that was not, I'm open to correction here, but that was not the way that I read this. Because if I read this as like, hey, Elpenor, yeah, we know you fell off the roof and died, but we were in a big hurry, right? We left his body in Circe's house, unwept, unburied. This other labor pressed us.
So I read it the first way that you mentioned the first time. I'm like, I kind of thought this was pretty sad that they didn't even notice he was gone the whole voyage, right? I mean, it's not just like they left him behind, but he wasn't on the boat. Nobody noticed. I went back and reread this, and I'm like, and it's pretty clear it's the other way, right? It's pretty clear that they were in a hurry, and they're like, I know we should have buried you, but.
So isn't there? There's immediately an irony here, right? Or at least a juxtaposition that they're hurrying down to the house of death while they have a comrade who they haven't given proper rituals to.
Well, especially if you think about the Iliad, right? So much of that is achieving the proper burial for Patroclus, and now admittedly, this is not Patroclus, but nonetheless, they didn't even offer him the barest of ritual.
I think the Patroclus narrative, though, from the Iliad helps shine a light on this, right? Because again, you're kind of, at least I'm left wondering, like, well, what does the ritual actually afford you? Like, here you are, you're in the same place everyone else seems to be in. Like, what does the ritual actually afford you? And I think the Patroclus narrative was a lot more clear about, what he could and could not do in the underworld, and that there's at least this broad understanding of, like, I don't have peace. Like, you've got to give me peace by the rituals. And I'm not sure, I'll just kind of throw this out. I'm not sure if that's connected to the other thing that confused me about this passage. And maybe I'm just misreading it. But Elpenor doesn't drink of the blood, does he?
No.
And so I thought you had to drink of the blood. Isn't that the whole mechanic that we've been given? Is that like you have this ritual, there's blood in this trench, and Odysseus somehow has to defend the trench, which is another question about how he's defending the trench from shades. But setting that aside, they have to drink the blood to be able to speak. But Elpenor doesn't have to speak or drink the blood to speak,
right.
apparently.
Right.
So,
Tiresias is, in the subsequent conversation he has with Tiresias, those are the instructions that Tiresias gives to Odysseus, is that you're to hold the sword in front of those shades to prevent them from drinking the blood, and only those that you allow to drink, they will regain their senses and they'll be able to converse with you. And so this is why the whole Elpenor exchange is very peculiar to me. A couple of things I would just mention is I find this character hilarious, in that here's a man who survived the Trojan War. Here's a man who survived Polyphemus. He was one of the guys that escaped out of the. He survived Circe's island, and how does he die? Well, he gets drunk, falls asleep on the roof, and then doesn't use the ladder, falls off the roof, and then comes crashing down, breaks his neck, and dies. So again, I find like his death, because I think in book 10, Odysseus in his narrative describes him as, how is it, none too brave in battle, none too sound in mind. So he's sort of a foolish little character, but I think, Deacon, you were asking, what is the point of this ritual, the burial? Were you asking why is this important?
Well, I think there's a twofold. One is, why is this important generally? Right? What does a proper ritual afford the dead? But then there's also the particular for Elpenor, because then he has like this particular instruction, which I think the most unique aspect of is that his oar is planted on top of his tomb. Right? There's a unique aspect to that.
Well, do you think that last line, it's at the very bottom of page 251, that would be line 85 or 86, where he says, so even men to come will learn my story. That there's a need that this minor tertiary character in the story that we only learn about once he slips and falls off the roof to his death, that somehow he needs to preserve his legacy, that this again sort of attaches to this very Achaean, this very Greek notion of honor or glory.
I think so, absolutely. I mean, I think that's strongly that there's still that hanging on that someone might yet hear of me, right? Is still this kind of this lingering idea. And I as to the not drinking, I think that there's a, Patroclus in the Iliad. Now, admittedly, we don't know how tightly connected these are is another question, but there's no sense of having to drink the blood either. That's introduced here, not in the Iliad. And if you wanted to tie those together, I think there might be an idea that while they haven't had the rituals done over them, there's a sense in which Elpenor has not actually fully entered into Hades, and he's here in a kind of in-between state, where there's this kind of restless state that you were talking about in the other case, and he needs these rites done over him. And he even says, unless some god's wrath come upon you, these are things that I was owed. I am one of your companions, and these ought to be done to give me rest, and also to give me some chance at fame, or kleos would probably be the better term here.
Yeah, I mean, this is the soul seeking immortality, right? This is Achilles' dilemma all over again, right? That I actually can live and become immortal in a certain way through my fame, through that glory. So I don't know. I mean, is that our best, or at least that's my best guess, or just kind of trying to pay attention to the text, is that the reason he must be able to speak, and I agree with you, Dr. Grabowski, that mechanic of the dead comes later.
I think it does. Actually, I'm looking here. It's a little bit. He does say a bit earlier at around 55, but I, the sharp sword drawn from beside my hip, sat down on alert there and never let go of the shambling, shifting dead come near that blood till I'd question Tiresias myself. But right after he says that, he lets one of the shades forward, which is bizarre. But I thought you were saying the mechanic, I think, comes later.
Well, I think Circe warned him about the sword and the blood and a little bit, right? Like, don't let anybody come until Tiresias comes up to drink the blood. Now, whether or not that's a fully explained mechanic, I don't think it comes about till Tiresias explains it.
Well, he knows this, right? Because he doesn't allow his mother to approach. Right. He knows Tiresias has to go first. So I guess in my mind, when I just try and, because obviously when I read Homer's a teacher. I think Homer has a rationale behind what he's doing. It seems to me that somewhat analogous to what Thomas said is that Elpenor being unritualized, I guess, right? He has this, he's not buried properly. He seems to be in a different state than the rest. And so I don't know if the drinking of the blood is that he's just in a different state than the rest of the shades. And he doesn't need that to speak. There's something of his current state of his soul, right? Is a robust word, his shade, right? His spirit, right? That thumos.
It's a little more substantial in some way, but not in a way that gives any peace, it seems.
Correct.
Well, there's also funny, just from a narrative structure and back from the dramatic structure, there's a bit of foreshadowing that goes on because he entreats Odysseus by those you left behind that are not here, right? And then he says by Telemachus, by your father, by Penelope, or I don't know if he lives her name, but by your wife. Implicitly, he's telling him who's okay and who's not okay, right? His mother, which he's also seen a shade of her, but there's an interesting way in which Elpenor is actually also, in some sense, conveying information to Odysseus. No, it's not done explicitly. Hey, let me tell you what happened. It's implicit, just by what he doesn't say and who he doesn't name.
Do we have anything? Does anyone give any commentary on the ore? This kind of unique aspect of his tomb, right? That we plant his ore, right, on his tomb. Now the ore is going to come up heavily here as a motif in the book, and I think there's a lot to parse out when Tiresias talks about an ore. But anything outside of just simply the fact that like this is his ore, like is this just making way for? Because the only way I can look at it as is that we get this kind of interesting picture of an ore on top of a tomb, and that's like okay, but what it's serving is a certain foreshadowing to the next ore. Does that make sense? And so I don't see it having like a particular tie-in to Elpenor, etc., outside the fact that he was simply an oarsman. But I think it serves as a foreshadowing to a thicker understanding of the next ore that comes in.
Well, at the very least, it provides those who encountered the tomb some indication as to who was buried there. That this was a warrior, that this was somebody who at least was associated with ships, presumably a warship. And so I think that this was just as we often use signs and symbols to convey a person's identity. I think that the ore in this particular case would be an indication to anybody who encountered the tomb. They wouldn't necessarily know specifically who was there, or maybe not, but at least they would know enough that this was a person who was associated with a naval battle. And yes, later the Odysseus's ore is mistaken for a winnow fan, which is actually hilarious because that tells, well, as we'll get to it, that tells me that the person who met this traveler who met Odysseus didn't know him from Adam. He was a nobody.
Okay, so let's look then when Odysseus is actually going to talk to Tiresias. So the first thing, as we kind of mentioned, actually his mom comes up. We really haven't thought about Odysseus' mother a whole lot. It's very clear that she was alive, and he thought that she was alive. But notice that he has kind of that thumos, that spirit, even though he breaks into tears, to not allow her to drink the blood before Tiresias. So, I mean, I did find that as like a certain level of arete, right? That he doesn't actually break into that emotion for that personal relationship, but is able to hold the line until he can talk to Tiresias. So Tiresias then gives us this narrative, which I find fascinating. I find this whole passage to be fascinating. So first, Tiresias confirms, right, that Poseidon is still angry with you, enraged because you blinded the Cyclops, his dear son. And so he tells him, like, well, you might be able to come home. And actually, all of your men might be able to come home. And I think that's important here. This is really presented as a choice. Like, if you do this thing, which is don't harm the cattle of the sun. You're going to come across the cattle of the sun. If you don't harm them, then you and your men may come home. But if you do harm them, then your ship and your men will be destroyed. And even if you escape, so him actually surviving the eating of the cattle is conditional. It might not happen, right? You might actually die. But if you do, then, all shipmates lost, alone in a stranger's ship, and you come home to a world of pain, which is then he's talking about, the suitors courting his wife, things like this. So there's a few things that I want to point out and see if you guys agree here. So one is I really don't know how much I think this is a choice. And I've really been thinking this. So on like very many of our podcasts, I've been sitting here parroting the normal thing, which is, hey, the Iliad is very fatalistic and the Odyssey has a lot more human agency in it and a choice. And when I was reading this, I really started debating with myself whether that was true or whether Homer is a lot more clever about the fatalism in the Odyssey, and Odysseus still really doesn't actually have a choice. And this is the reason I think this. So this whole thing is presented as a choice, right? If you don't eat the cattle, then you and your men will survive and you'll be able to come home. If you do eat the cattle, then your men are dead, your ship is gone, and you might come home. And if you do come home, you come to a world of pain. The reason I say, is this truly a choice, is because, well, one, when we get to that book, we'll see that you see very clearly that fate moves things, so this pretty much happens. But in a more specific way, if you remember all the way back to book 2, when the suitors are harassing the old seer on Ithaca, I don't remember his name, but remember he tells them like, Odysseus is coming back soon, and they're like, shut up, old man, blah, 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 blah. And then he just randomly drops this truth, and he's like, oh, well, by the way, do you remember when Odysseus left? I said that he would come back alone, and all men lost, and no one would know him. So it really struck me here of like, wait, how much of this is actually a choice and how much of this is fatalistic? Not eating the cattle is seen as a choice. You can save your men. You could all come home. But prior to this choice, we already have a prophecy that he comes back by himself. Does that make sense? There's a tension here in the text that I don't think I realized the first time, but being sensitive to the fatalism of the Iliad and kind of thinking that the Odyssey's has more agency, more human freedom in it. I've been kind of tracking this more, and I don't know. I really questioned: is this really a choice?
Well, drawing beyond the bounds of Homer for the minute, the question between free will and destiny is, a common philosophical theme that I think can be resolved here as well, in a sense of knowing that someone could be free to choose an action, and yet the actual choice that they make still be foreknown, right? So that they weren't necessitated by the prophecy as if the prophecy itself was the cause of them making this choice, but the prophecy can still foretell which choice they're going to freely make in the moment. And one would have to go into a much broader argument about the working of free will, but in some ways a dramatic or narrative structure almost works in a parable kind of form to work that out for us. And it's a way in which we can see, in so many cases in stories, where I always like Lord of the Rings analogies, for example, so I'll go with Lord of the Rings. Gollum could have done something else, and yet it's fair in the sort of narrative structure. We know exactly that Gollum is not going to repent. Ahab didn't have to keep chasing the whale, but we know that he's going to. And I think there's something like that here, although it's more subtle here. And I think also with Tiresias, there's a strong sense, and we'll bring this up because this is a theme I think Tiresias is keen on, is like key, not just keen, but key about, is that there are actions that have consequences and they have judgments. There's a moral quality to the Tiresian kind of structure here. You were fated to blind Polyphemus's eye, but that has this particular consequence, and it's going to play out. The suitors have done these particular actions, and a certain judgment will be visited on them. He is this figure that spans the past and the present and the future. I mean, he is a figure of the past. He's speaking in the present. He's foretelling the future, but they're all pretty much one to him. He's I think in that theme of judgment is going to stretch all the way to the end of this book.
Well, I think that I agree. I think that what you have touched upon is a perennial truth, or a perennial question at least, right? What is the relationship between the divine will and human freedom? But I think it's interesting here that, for most, if you just jump ahead a couple thousand years, most people, if they have to answer that question, turn to Boethius, right? That's what Thomas Aquinas turns to, right? He turns to Boethius, Saint Boethius, in his Consolation of Philosophy, which gives this beautiful, beautiful rendition. So if the podcast is around for 20 years, we'll get there. But he gives this beautiful rendition of, well, God's outside of time. And so the problem that we always make here is that we think that, foreknowledge of something necessitates an action in the future. So if the prophet says, hey, you're going to do this, then I have to do that thing because it was foreknown by God. And he does a wonderful job there stating like, well, God's outside of time. And so your past, present, and future are all one simultaneous whole. They don't bind each other. His knowledge of what you do is simultaneous. So that it doesn't bind people. And I think this is actually a mistake that I think a lot of even mainline religions make. However, I don't think you can make that argument with the Greek pantheon. They're all clearly inside of time, right? They're all beings inside of creation. And so it's really, so that's my point here, is that I agree with you that if we talk about God proper, right, and we deal in like proper theology, there's a way in which prophecy and understanding the future doesn't actually necessitate, right, our actions. However, or at least God's foreknowledge doesn't. If you want to call it foreknowledge, because that's even an analogy, because we're putting him like on time, right? There's a before and after. But you can't do that with Zeus. Like Zeus is just up there on Mount Olympus. He from my understanding, he's simply suffering through time as well, right? So this is the thing, is that then when Zeus gives this prophecy to a prophet and says, Odysseus is coming back by himself. He'll come back, but he's coming back by himself. After that point, when Circe or Tiresias or anyone else says, well, Odysseus, you might save your men if you will do X, Y, and Z. I just don't know. I mean, I don't know if that's true. I don't even know. Like, typically the normal read is Odysseus has agency. He can make this choice, and he makes some bad choices, and they all come back. Is he a good leader? Is he not a good leader? Like, his men have a mutiny against him. So is it his fault they don't come back, et cetera? Those are good questions. But I just don't know if there's a true choice here.
Well, I would just add one point, and that would be the words that Tiresias uses twice, both at the beginning of this these predictions or these forecasts, and at the end, where he says that he's going to tell Odysseus the truth, or that he's going to speak infallibly. And he concludes, he says, all that I have told you will come true. And then how does Odysseus respond? O Tiresias, surely the gods have spun this out as fate. And so, yeah, there does seem to be this veneer of choice or agency that the gods at least want us to believe that we have some power or control over our destinies. But that at the end of the day, we all know what's going to happen, right? All of these conditionals, right? If you curb your thumos, if you curb your wild desire, he says, then you may come home with your crew and your ship. But we know that this isn't going to happen. We know that Odysseus isn't going to be able to curb his thumos. Well, and the same with all these other conditionals. See, I noticed the same thing you did, Deacon, which is that most of this is couched in terms of hypotheticals. If A, then B. And then he follows all the way through, but it just seems like the consequences are determined. That this is going to happen. You're going to come home a broken man, alone. You're going to have to kill off these suitors either by craft or by physical force. And then once you've done that, you have to journey out yet again. And there's no getting around it. This will happen. What I say will come true. Yeah, Thomas?
Well, I was just say, I mean, on the conditional side, I think there's two parts. One, I think conditional prophecy is a thing. I mean, especially if we put it towards like the scriptural side, you see some prophecies in scripture are absolute, and others are of a conditional nature. You might think of, let's say, the destruction of Nineveh. Like, if Nineveh does not repent, then, and that follows the same. Now, we can, presume from that if Nineveh hadn't repented, those prophecies, in fact, would have come to pass, but it did repent. But I think in this case, you see, he doesn't curb his thumos. I think there's two interesting things about that. One, previous to this, would that have even been a how to put it, advocated in a way that was sort of seen as praiseworthy? Like, if you think about the generally speaking, the increase of appetite and power and dominion was the goal. And now Tiresias is saying you must restrain yourself. And which I think is itself is a very interesting shift, right? This is different. I think secondly, what's interesting about it is that Odysseus tries not, I mean, we're leaping ahead slightly about the cattle, but he tries not to stop at the island. And his men want to anyway, and he gives in, but he never eats of the cattle, and they do. I wonder if this is a sense in which he does restrain himself, right? He alone restrains himself. Now, whether he might have been able to save his men or not, what I'm getting, I guess, here's the thing. You might have it as a kind of contrast being posited between Odysseus, who overcomes these temptations and does restrain himself, contrasted against his men who do not.
Well, and he's done this already once in Polyphemus's cave, where he could have easily have killed Polyphemus, but he doesn't, because he knows that if he were to kill the Cyclops, that they'd never get out of the cave. They'd never be able to move the stone. And he even recognizes this once he returns back to Ithaca. There's a moment where he says, well, look, I've got to hold back. I can't lash out at these suitors, not yet. There's a time and a place. And so he does have, he is capable of restraint. But you're right, Thomas, that it isn't him that causes the death of Helios's cattle. It's his crew.
Yeah, and I think that the extolling of restraint is itself just like worth remarking on here. That restraint has not been, I would say, an Achaean virtue up to this point, really, and now it's being set forward. And also, I mean, I think this is also Tiresias' speech. In addition to this linking of the past and the present and the future, this infallible quality to it, it has a shift in goal. Because when he prophesies over Odysseus' fate, that he's going to essentially die among his own people, in peace with his friends around him, his kinfolk, really. This is a very different vision, and we'll get into even more of this when we have the Achilles speech in a little bit. But I mean that there's an idea here of a shift in what it means to be a complete man, right? Odysseus is this complete hero who makes the return. I mean, again, that alone is a contrast that we can make in a minute to, say, Achilles and Agamemnon. We mentioned this before, but the heroic journey has to be this. It has to be both the going out and the return and the homecoming. It's not complete without the homecoming. And
Right.
Odysseus makes this homecoming, but then he dies ultimately at peace with himself, at peace with his kin, and at peace with the gods. And all of this is prophesied over him. And this is, again, not an Achilles-like face. You'll have great glory. In fact, one could argue Odysseus has greater glory. But the ultimate prophecy is you will be at peace at all of these levels, with yourself, with your kin, and with the gods.
Well, let's look at let's return to Tiresias' words and so kind of work through these. So we have this thing of the cattle, and we've questioned the conditional nature of this, and how do you read this prophecy alongside other prophecies? I mean, one thing that occurs to me is like, is there a hierarchy? Because Tiresias is known as the unerring prophet. So if another prophet has said something like, is there a hierarchy here? I mean, can we take a moment, though, and talk about Tiresias? Because I forgot to introduce him as a character, because he's hilarious. So Tiresias, I don't know if you guys know his backstory. It's really funny. there's two stories. So one is that he sees Athena bathing, which is funny because usually you think of Artemis, right? But he sees Athena bathing and she strikes him blind, but Athena is friends with his mother. And so he gets like a consideration, like, well, I'll make you a wonderful prophet, even though you're blind. So Tiresias is the blind prophet. The second one is a hilarious story in which, very short, Tiresias sees two snakes that are coupling, and he kills one, and it turns him into a woman. And then he lives as a woman for an indeterminate period of time. And then he sees snakes coupling again, and he kills one, and he's turned back into a man. And Zeus and Hera then get into an argument about who derives the most pleasure from sex. And who do they think can be a good judge about this? Tiresias, because he's been both a man and a woman. And so they go to him. He's not blind yet. They go to him and ask him who derives the most pleasure. And I talk about this in our guide because the mythology here is just comical. And he says that the woman derives like 9 times more pleasure than the man does in sexual intercourse. And Hera just thinks this is ridiculous and strikes him blind for his answer. Right? So this is how he becomes blind. And then Zeus, being Zeus, kind of feels bad for him and gives him the gift of prophecy, but actually calls him the unerring prophet, right? And then he is, for those who are familiar, the next year, we're most likely going to read a lot of the Greek plays. Tiresias is a character that pops up over and over again. He's in Antigone, he's in the Bacchae. Like, he just kind of becomes, if you like Lord of the Rings things, right? He's like the Gandalf character. He's just in the back. He pops up every time they need like the prophet or the seer to come in and tell you what the gods think on something, right? He just becomes this ubiquitous character. But anyway, that's his backstory, that, at some point he was a woman and then turns back to a man and then gave commentary on how sexuality works. So that's our wonderful prophet that we're down here in the depths of hell visiting. The other thing I want to point out here is when he talks about Odysseus, like, so if he eats the cattle and he's going to be broken, one thing that on this read through I've really been asking myself is, what actually precipitated the suitors? Like, what actually precipitated Ithaca going into this kind of chaotic political disorder? And I don't mean, obviously, like, his absence is the most natural explanation, but is there like a prophetic or a curse that has done this? And when I read in book 9, when we read the Cyclops, it really dawned on me this time that usually I attribute his journey home and the hardships there as what was happening with the Cyclops. And then the suitors are something different, right? But I noticed this time when I read that is that the Cyclops says, hey, if he has to make it home, then make him come home to a world of pain. And that's actually the exact same phrase that Tiresias uses. He uses the same words as the Cyclops here. And so it's really interesting that the narrative of the suitors has already started, even before Tiresias says, or you'll come home to a world of pain. That has already started, I think, because of the Cyclops. So it was interesting to me then, if the Cyclops is the one that actually precipitates the suitors, then in what way is Tiresias saying, well, if you eat the cattle, you'll come home to a world of pain? And I guess the only way I could make him kind of square up well is like, well, if he could somehow not eat the cattle, he'd come home, and we know the suitors are already there, but he'd come home with a ship. He'd come home with other men that were on his side. And so it seems like at this point, it's a question of degree, right? The suitors are already there. They're already causing this disorder, but it can become worse, right? It can actually increase in severity. And so if you eat the cattle, the pain you'll find at home will become worse. And I think that happens because then he comes home and he's by himself. And then he has, as you guys mentioned, he has a certain level of restraint. But I think a lot of narratives are living in his head about how he has to take his kingdom back.
Well, also, you've got an additional at least 7 years, right? So that's all. I mean, the suitors will have been eating him out of house and home and plaguing his wife and son for a lot longer with this delay.
Correct. Yeah, that's good. Oh, yeah, that's another way to see the severity of it, is that it actually lengthens it, right? Because then he goes to Calypso's island. No, I like that as well.
Mm-hmm.
So let's look at the... Oh, go ahead.
I was just say, it says there's an interesting line here at the end of Tiresias' prosody when he says, "The death, this peaceful death, but will finally come to you," and it says it's from the sea. And I think this is just apparently a very ambiguous line, because I looked at different translations and different commentaries, and they take it very just completely different ways. One seems to be that somehow or other there's this unnamed death that is related to the sea that will eventually get him. It's a little unclear what, but I mean, you
Wait,
could
so
read that
I want to be clear, Thomas. Your translation says the death will come from the sea?
from the sea.
Far from the sea.
Our-
See,
Ours
See,
says far from the sea, as in
that's
as
where it
in
gets
death is
tricky.
gonna happen. So yours actually says the death will come from the sea?
yes, it's from the sea, and mine even has I have a little footnote here that
Probably
It's
away from the sea. I think that's probably what the translator was intending to convey. Not like a big tidal wave would engulf him.
Well, this is the thing. This is the question. It says apparently, so goes the footnote in my thing, that it's ambiguous. It's ambiguous as to whether or not it's saying that he would be away from or far from the sea, which is apparently how it's been taken mostly in the modern translations, or
Right.
as it were, sourced from or coming from the sea, which is apparently how Aeschylus and Sophocles and others read it. Now, I think the question is, like, depending on which one you take, you could either see a sort of ultimate victory of Poseidon in this, or, and I do like the away from the sea rendering that's admittedly a little bit more modern, but I think there's an idea here that one of the commentaries I read brought out, that there's a notion of sacrifice. The way at least one of the commentators read it is that Odysseus is never going to go to sea again. Like, part of his sacrifice is ultimate of this planting the oar toward Poseidon and making this offering to Poseidon is also the offering that even though he is the king of a sea country, that he will not himself go to sea again, and he'll die away from the sea. I think this is an interesting notion of piety, if so, that ultimately he does have some sacrifice to make back to Poseidon, and part of that sacrifice is that he, will never, as it were, tread on Poseidon's territory again.
Well, that's fascinating to me. Because that's very different than like how I think Fagel sets it up in his translation. Because let's put this a little bit in context, right? So the second thing that Tiresias tells him is that, because this is the completely new narrative, right? This isn't something that's been in the text before. At least I have not seen any foreshadowing of this. This is a completely new narrative. That, hey, by the way, once you make it to Ithaca, you have to leave again. I mean, this is somewhat of a heartbreaking narrative, right? Like, once you get home to Ithaca, if you make it there, you have to leave again on this penitential journey. And in short, you basically have to walk inland holding an oar until someone mistakes it for a winnowing fan, right? This tool that is used to separate the chaff from the grain. And it's there then that he has to make a penitential sacrifice to Poseidon. And then when he gets back, he has to make a sacrifice to all the gods. So the reason then, which I think there's a lot there we need to look at, but to piggyback on your comment, Thomas, then that's why I think Fagel's translation makes so much more sense to me, far from the sea, right? Because then once he does his penitential journey, he's guaranteed a gentle, painless death, surrounded by his people in peace. And it makes sense to me that it's far from the sea because he's made peace with Poseidon, right? That the sea is not going to be his death, which is such a reality for him right now.
So I have a couple of questions for both of you, and that is, Ithaca is not a very large island. It's only about 45 square miles or so. So it's relatively small. So the first question I have is, as we look at this prophecy, who wouldn't on that island recognize an oar as an oar? I mean, I'm assuming that, again, given how small this island is, not that everyone is seafaring, but they would at least know an oar for what it is, and they wouldn't mistake it for a winnowing fan. That's my first question. Another question is, who on this island wouldn't recognize Odysseus for Odysseus? I mean, he is, after all, the king of Ithaca. And this traveler, and maybe this is not someone from Ithaca, but this person doesn't know what an oar is. This person doesn't know who Odysseus is. And this is all very strange to me, given
Well,
how small this island is. So I'm not sure if either of you found that peculiar.
Well, you're challenging my presumption, and now I'm trying to go back and look at the text because I didn't take that this was going to be on Ithaca.
I just says carry your well-planned oar until you come to a race. So go forth once more you must. Now, are we to assume that he is going to be sailing out, or that he is just simply going to walk inland?
Well,
I think the latter.
Yeah, and also part of Ithaca is on the mainland. Because at least
Okay, I assumed that it was just the small.
Well, I don't. Well, hold on. Let's characterize some things. So one, I just read it as you have to go inland, right? I didn't read it as because you have to come to a race like a people. There's not going to be another people group on Ithaca, and they don't season their food with the salt of the sea. They don't.
I loved that line, by the way. That they don't. I mean, because you've got here this idea of someone who knows so little, or literally nothing of the sea, that they literally don't. They never tasted salt on their food. They don't even know what that is.
But the reason, and I don't know if it's conditional upon this. Like, I don't know if Ithaca having holdings on the mainland really is actually dispositive of this question at all. But if I recall correctly, when Odysseus does make it home and it's talking about Ithaca and it talks about his herds and stuff like that, it talks about his holdings on the mainland. That there's these, because they also don't have a place for horses on the island itself, but they have horses, but they don't have any place for them on the island itself. But I don't know, like if that's a yes or no, if that's even correct, like how much that actually sheds any light on this particular thing. I just took it as he has to go inland and has to go for a very long time until this is not going to be a short journey. And then he's holding this oar. So the oar comes back. And this is where I really just dug into like the symbolism of like, why is this? And I think I don't know. These are a few of my shots in the dark. One is it makes sense. Like the winnowing fan, typically in the ancient world, is always a sign of judgment, right? Because what are you doing with the winnowing
threshing?
Fan?
Yeah,
you're threshing. You're lifting up these things in the air. The air's going to blow the chaff away, which is the negative, the damned, and the real things, the grain falls back to the earth, right? So the winnowing, to be winnowed, is to have judgment. And so it makes sense to me then that on his penitential journey, his oar is mistaken then for a sign of judgment or something that's an analog for judgment. The other thing too is that then I was like, okay, well, is there a thing for Elpenor here? Right? We had this weird thing of the stacking of the oar on top of the tomb. And the only thing I could really think of there is that when Odysseus then plants his oar, what is it that dies in that spot? And he makes sacrifices so that it does become a place of death. But then, could you make an argument that like Poseidon's wrath dies? It's a tomb for that wrath. Could you make an argument that it's a tomb for Odysseus's pride? That pride has finally died in him? Maybe that's why I didn't read it, that he'll never go back on the seas again, but that's an interesting read, Thomas, or a commentary that you picked up. And so, is there something in him that dies then?
I took a more cynical view, actually. I think what dies is his kleos. Because the people that encounter this oar aren't even going to recognize it as an oar. They're going to recognize it as a winnow fan. And so I think that this is Poseidon's, well, this may or may not be a correct interpretation, but I take this to be Poseidon's great revenge. That Odysseus becomes the pseudonym that he used in order to escape from Polyphemus's cave. He's becomes Utis. He becomes a nobody. Now the joke is on Poseidon because, of course, Odysseus is his life lives on in the epic. But at least from Odysseus's point of view, he dies peacefully. He dies among friends, but he doesn't die on the sea. And the monument to Odysseus is in a foreign land where those people don't even understand what boats are or what oars are, and they'll take it to be a winnow fan and presumably to be a tomb or a grave dug for a farmer. or a winnower or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I took a more cynical view of this as, this is Poseidon's great revenge on Odysseus, is to ironically turn him into the person that he pretended to be in Polyphemus's cave.
You're not taking that Odysseus was to die on this journey, though, right? Because it
No,
says
he's
here
coming back.
Yeah.
He's
but his
coming
glory
back.
dies, right? His kleos.
Yeah.
His kleos dies. This is yeah.
That is a fascinating take. I love the I'm always tempted by really enjoying these takes that kind of like fold something back in from the previous narrative. Like then he becomes like nobody. Like I just really like that. That just sounds great. I took it as, I have to think about that more. I took it as a comparison to Achilles, which I think is very pertinent for this book. Because look, Achilles then, remember, makes this choice. I'm not going to go back and live and have a peaceful life because then I die and no one knows my name. So I'm not going to find immortality through my progeny. I'm going to find immortality through fame and glory. And he makes this choice. And in a certain way here, I think Odysseus gets both. Right, so he goes through the Troy narrative, he goes through the Iliad, he goes through his own Odyssey, then he has to have this other penitential journey. He comes home. His name's going to live on forever, even without a glorious death, which is interesting, right? His name will actually live on forever without the glorious death. And he gets peace all around him to live out his old age. So in certain ways, did he not just receive both? That he,
I think so for sure. I mean, I think in the sense of the idea of the complete hero, where everyone else ends up being a partial hero, or maybe not so much a hero at all. Now, I do think there is a sense in where the shift is going on. One, I do like the idea of winnowing fan his judgment, because I think Tiresias is the general arc of Tiresias and his prophecy is one of judgment. But the second, I think the Kleos dying, or at least Kleos being kind of is pushed down, it is there because I think the theme of the book is of this shift away from glory as the ultimate end of man and into something more transcendent. At the same time, it's also more humble, because we have here there's not a lot of narratives about immortality that are that aren't of the immortals themselves, right? So here we have some notion of the immortality of the soul. Mind you, it's a kind of thin notion of the soul, but nonetheless, there's a notion here now of life after death, and also of what the good life would mean for a human being. And both of these are being stretched out here into saying that no, it's not just fame. In fact, it's something else. It's about home. It's about family. It's about, again, this sort of notion of harmony or peace with men and with the gods. And that's being stretched out as higher than Kleos, though Kleos is not being so much subverted as to being not a good thing at all. It's just not the main thing.
Yeah, it strikes me that my take about Odysseus having both of Achilles' options, and Frank's take on that his Kleos dies aren't actually mutually exclusive, because there's a shift there, right? So if you take that as like when he does this, he's done with his heroics. He's done. He's done with the thumos, the spirited part. He's done with it, right? And then he just goes back to Ithaca and lives out a long, peaceful life. Then, yeah, I'm sure those two narratives are actually competitive with one another.
Well, don't they have to go together? I mean, in a sense of to be a real, it is part of life that for most of time and stretching into the future, that sometimes men will have to go to war. But they also have to have some mechanism to come home. And they can't just be, the soldier that they were at home. And I don't think if you...
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. I think that, not to jump too far ahead, like another couple thousand years, but I think that Dante then has a fascinating commentary on this, right? Because then Dante, in his Inferno, basically invents a story that Odysseus can't stay at home, that this doesn't happen, that he can't actually do this, and he has to go on another adventure, which is predicated on his pride, and he does die at the sea. So it's just really, I think it's a fascinating passage then about what happens.
I think bringing up Dante is good just in general, by the way, just to throw out in this sort of dramatic structure and the importance of Book 11, is that I don't think you can imagine the Divine Comedy without Book 11. I mean, the Divine Comedy is Dante's take. And almost, one of the commentaries I read sort of joked that the Divine Comedy is Dante's commentary on Book 11.
I do think there's a lot of parallels between the Odyssey and the Divine Comedy, and I'm always really struck by people who argue, which I think is the mainline argument, that Dante had no direct access to the Odyssey or the Iliad, that all these things are indirect for him. So, anyway, not to get lost on that. Okay, would anyone like to pick up the narrative of him speaking to his mother? So we're on.
I would actually. I find this to be quite interesting. Yeah. So yeah, if I may, I mean, so he encounters his mother, and she is permitted to drink the blood, and they begin to have this exchange where, she's obviously. I mean, she tells us how distraught she was while her son was away, and we learn that she, in effect, dies of a broken heart. But what I find really fascinating is, and I'd like to hear what you guys say about this, how he asks her questions about members of his family, and the order in which he asks them, and specifically what he wants to know about Penelope. So he questions. First of all, he asks Anticlea, what form of death overcame you? What laid you low? How did you die? So the first person that he wants to know about is his mother, and what caused her death. And then he asks, tell me of father. Then he says, tell of the son I left behind. So that's Telemachus. Do my royal rights still lie in their safekeeping, or does some stranger hold the throne? And then he says, please tell me about my wife. Now, he doesn't call her by name. He doesn't refer to the dad or his son by name either. But then he says, tell me about her turn of mind and her thoughts. Now, I looked in the Greek, and basically what he's asking is about her nous, not her thumos, not about her state of mind, not her state of emotion, state of spirit. And then he asks, still standing fast behind our son, still guarding our great estates. Is she keeping the property tidy and clean, and is it well protected? He's not asking about where she is emotionally, where she is in terms of her state of her feelings. And then he finally concludes by asking, or has she wed somebody else? And then we'll get into this, but what Anticlea then ends up doing is inverting the order of the people. The first person that she addresses is Penelope, and then Telemachus, and then his father, and then finally herself. But then when Anticlea talks about the wife, she doesn't speak to her nous, but she speaks to her thumos. So I'm wondering, is this significant? Is this revealing something? Is Homer trying to reveal something to us, or is Odysseus, since he's narrating this, trying to reveal something to us about where he places value in terms of family, in terms of the soul, in terms of what matters, what truly matters, the elevation of mind or nous? Because we've been talking about how he's been very effective in pushing down or suppressing his thumos. And so are we beginning to kind of see the early emergence here of the elevation of nous and the tripartite soul? So there's an awful lot going on here. And I wonder what you have to say.
Nous here, then, just as like a working definition, right? This is the mind.
Yeah, it's noos, so it's the Homeric ancient version of nous, which is mind. So how's her mind?
Yeah, it's an antecedent, right, to what we would think of the
Yeah.
mind.
How's her reason? And then the word that's translated here as thoughts is sometimes can be translated as determination or will. Like, is she determined? Is she stalwart?
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, he does not know about Agamemnon yet, correct?
No.
Because that very clearly colors. I mean, that's one thing to think about is the Agamemnon narrative, right? I mean, that runs as a parallel pretty much to the entire Odyssey and affects, both Telemachus and Odysseus. So it's interesting here that he's asking about his wife, who very much is seen as the keeper of the estate. Has she wed someone else? Really, without even knowing the Agamemnon narrative yet.
Yes. But the mother seems to be far more concerned about the welfare of Penelope than Odysseus does, at least to my reading.
Mm-hmm.
And that because she keeps herself, what eventually caused her death, she saves that for last. So it's just interesting to me that Odysseus, I mean, this stands to me in very stark contrast with the way that Hector is portrayed in Book 6 of the Iliad, and the tenderness that he shows his wife and his son. Odysseus comes across here to me as rather cold-hearted, because all he really seems to be concerned about is, well, is she keeping my estates in good order? Has she married somebody else? I mean, it just seems very transactional to me.
And even the mother's response, I agree with you, like hers seems much more sympathetic, right? The poor woman suffering so, her life in endless hardship. But before switching to the son, she actually just reassures Odysseus, no one has taken over your royal rights.
Right.
Not yet. So she does address what he seems to be more after, is like, does my kingdom still stand?
Right.
Well, I think there's something in that twofold, or maybe more than two. One, it's fair, I think, to some extent, his situation to be very concerned as to the welfare of that question: does my kingdom still stand? Right? He has responsibilities that are not merely personal, and there's a reason to wonder about the welfare of what amounts to be all of Ithaca. Is my heir is my heir still in power, and does he still have an estate? I think that's a fairly in the position as a royal family. I think that makes some level more sense, and then also that places her in a level of great responsibility. That's again not merely on a romantic dimension, right? The question is she is she looking after everything? Is essentially a question of state, as well. And I don't think that's necessarily unreasonable. I think the other thing that's at least interesting is, if not terribly romantic, seems slightly romantic and in a kind of Odysseus way, is that Penelope is shown again and again to relate to him at the level of mind, right? That they're portrayed again and again to be of one mind. And I don't, I think in that sense, you could, again, at least I'm making the argument that his lack of concern over her emotional state, or like, how's she feeling, might actually not be meant as a slight so much as that emotions are not ultimately the basis of their relationship. That their union is more of mind than it is of emotion.
I like that. Because that would align well with how he answers Calypso on the island. Remember, Calypso's like, "Oh, am I not more beautiful than your wife?" Which he pretty much says, "Yes, you're an immortal." But then remember, he says he comments on her Penelope's cleverness, and she's already been talked about as the matchless queen of cunning. So yeah, I like that. I mean, it is. I agree with Dr. Grabowski's read that I think, particularly on its face, it's somewhat. There seems to be kind of a jarring there, but it could be, just insofar as like Odysseus's commentary seems very transactional, like how's my estates, etc. And then the mother gives like a very much emotional, like how is Penelope's like actual spirit doing, right? Well, she's suffering terribly. But I do like the understanding of like him asking about her mind seems to be the thing that he's attracted to her about the most. So I do like that.
Well, could I add one, or just ask one more question? Because he does show great emotion towards his mother, right? When he tries to embrace her. I mean, he's obviously, he's devastated that she's died, and he tries to reach out to her, as we'll see, and his arms slip through her. I mean, is this a case where he meets people where they're at, where Penelope is very, noose oriented, but his mom is more thematic, and so he's going to, given how he's a man of many turns, he's very versatile, that he will provide the person with whom, that he's with the sort of relationship that suits them. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does.
I think it does. And go ahead.
Because he clearly shows his mother. There's way more emotion in how he responds to his mother's death, having met her in Hades, than his concern for his wife. So I just found that very strange.
Well, what I was going to say is we brought this up in the Sunday Great Books, and I think it applies here, that you see Odysseus relate to women in very different ways across the Odyssey. And I think what you're just seeing, there's a portion of this, which is he relates to Nausicaa one way, he relates to Areta another way, his mother one way, Penelope another way, and so forth. I think you're seeing and all of these are appropriate in their own dimension. I'm leaving aside the goddesses at the moment, because one, they're not really women, he's protective, for example, over Nausicaa's reputation. He's very affectionate with his mother. He treats Penelope as every bit his equal. These are very, he honors Arete or Arete. Pronouncing her name gets me, but I think there's a multivalence man to woman relationship going on as well.
Well, that might be a good segue into this is where we receive, then, after the mother, we receive this grand array of women, which I found to be like a very bizarre, like the first time I read it, because we've been paying so much attention to Homer and like these themes and what he's doing, and this one I really found out of place. I was like, wait, what is happening right now? So we get his mom. His mom's also a suicide, right? We should probably mention that, or at least that's how I read it, right? That she can't stand Odysseus being away, and that also might. I wonder if that also explains why Laertes is so disconnected, because that's something too I've always wondered, is like, Laertes, the former king, is still on Ithaca, and there's Penelope suffering greatly while he's off playing dirt farmer and being sad. It's like, brother, what are you doing? Like, go back to your son's kingdom and do something. So if his wife's a suicide, and there's this like overwhelming grief for Odysseus being gone, which lays a real personal character on, like, if you take his agency correctly, he's the reason that he's gone, is this curse that Calypso put on him because of his actions. But we get this array of women, and I'm not sure if it's overly fruitful to go through all of them, but I will say what really stood out to me, because I paid attention to them and tried to see, like, okay, well, some of these are giving birth to demigods, and like they're in this group, and how can they cascade? But I think the thing that really stuck out to me are the bookends. That this starts off with his mom, right? That's where the narrative. I mean, she's not part of the array, but the narrative of the mother speaking bookends, and then Persephone, right? This queen of the underworld, like she's in charge of the seasons, and so she sends this array. You get an array of women. And then it ends with this breaking of the narrative of not the retelling, but it breaks back to Odysseus. He pauses, and it breaks into him in King Alcinous's court. And the one that speaks first is Queen Arete. So we get this big array of women, bookended by Odysseus's mother and Queen Arete, which I guess are two queens.
Mm-hmm. And I will say that as well, that the narrative as it regards women is dominated by mothers. right? There are mentions of in was it more simply a wife dimension or maidens, but that is compressed versus where most of the text related to women is focused on mothers, which I
And
think again
I would add
connects.
one more
Yeah.
thing. What I found interesting about this litany or this cavalcade of women um, is that, first of all, Odysseus speaks on their behalf. So he doesn't interact with them as he interacts with the other shades, or most of the other shades. He doesn't allow them to speak for themselves. And what we learn about them isn't so much about them themselves as it is about their husbands, their lovers, their children. And so we learn about not so much who they are, but the people in their lives. And so, I don't know what to make of that. Is Odysseus here being a misogynist by not allowing these women to speak and to tell their own stories? Or, I think what is more likely is that, yes, this does lead up to Arete, basically bursting out in applause and saying, "What a wonderful story, Odysseus. Here are some gifts for you. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we showered more treasures so that you could journey home with them to help engorge your chaos?" So I'm wondering if these women are inserted there as a way of inviting both Alcinous and Arete to provide them with, or to provide him and his family with all these treasures.
The thing that I would note too is that when Queen Arete kicks in, is like line 380 or so, we kind of get the order that I was anticipating when Odysseus threw himself at the knees of Queen Arete. Do you remember this? He throws himself at the knees, and I remember I expected Queen Arete to say something, but she doesn't. Here, right, she does burst out, and she basically intercedes for him. And so I was like, oh, is the queen finally playing her role? She's playing that kind of Bronze Age intercessor role. And then notice, again, it's not the king that speaks up next. It's this eldest lord, the same guy that last time was basically like, hey, King Alcinous, your guest is over there wallowing in the ashes underneath the hearth. Like, don't you think we should, like, welcome him? And then King Alcinous, this is a little bit before line 400, stepped in grandly and then basically, confirms what they've said. So there's this cascading order again of like the queen to the eldest lord to then the king finally kind of stepping in. And that's the order that, I didn't expect the eldest lord, but the queen role here is what I kind of expected more concretely the first time he landed at her knees.
Mm-hmm.
But mind you, I want to preface this that I do not know the stories behind all of these women that go through this. That said, it's also worth noting that there's a kind of a grouping that he makes throughout it. The first mothers that he describes all had gods as lovers and gave birth to these quasi-divine children. And this would be better to say they gave birth to heroes, like capital H, heroes. So this would have been within the Greek culture, like the ultimate, in a weird way, ideal of motherhood is to be the mother of a hero. And then this next grouping is of all mortal women with mortal husbands that had nonetheless great children of some sort. And I mean, in that group, you've got Jocasta and Chloris, for example. So Jocasta having Oedipus, which is, a tragic story here. But then also there's even a contrast with that. So Chloris is either the mother or grandmother of Nestor, right? So you have kind of like a woman who has, is happy in her fate. As far as I understand it, right, Chloris has a fairly normal and happy life. She son Nestor, and then there's her daughter Hero that everyone wants to marry, and this sort of thing is, and then contrasted with Jocasta, who has this ultimately tragic sort of fate. And then the next grouping all have twins, which is interesting, right? This idea of having twins has some sort of additional mythological or almost quasi-religious tone to it as well. I think of those, the most interesting are Castor and Pollux, right? Because there's an interesting line there, because they're said to be under the how's it put it? They're I wish I could find it. Something about being covered under the life-bearing ground or something. There's some notion. But this, I looked that up, and it's exactly the same line as in the Iliad, where Helen is standing on the walls, looking for her brothers, Castor and Pollux, not knowing that they were underneath the life-giving ground. And according to the legend, it's sort of interesting as well. There's a filial dimension here, because Castor was mortal and Pollux was immortal, and he shared his immortality with his brother, which is why one lives for each day. It's like an alternation. It's he, rather than remaining immortal, shared his immortality with his brother in order to keep to allow them both to live. Is that just all these little interesting little backstories going on, trailing through here? But they're not really explained. They're not really developed.
Do you see that leading into Arete anyway, like that maternity?
So I think somehow, right?
I mean, she bookends it, so there has to be something there, but she doesn't. Well, I don't know. It doesn't occur to me like that she has any heroic son. She has Nausicaa, this gorgeous princess who seems to be virtuous on her own, but she doesn't. Does she fit that mold?
I think there must be some way in which this general extolling of motherhood is meant to be praising, or at least interesting to her, like an interesting. I mean, I think there's some way that Alcinous even hints that the story is being crafted in such a way as to be pleasing to the current company. So I think there's some sense of that. He also, right at the end, mentions Ariadne and Eriphthile or something like. Anyway, you have maidens then at the end, right? Now Ariadne gets abandoned, and I believe Eriphthile abandons her lover. So you have one of these contrasts between the, like a Jocasta to Chloris kind of contrast, but where Ariadne is abandoned, the other one abandons, which is an interesting.
No, I like that. I appreciate you kind of leading us through that. Let's push forward to a statement that I found to be hilarious, which is King Alcinous is talking, and this is like 4:11, 4:12. He says, "Ah, Odysseus." Alcinous replied, "One look at you, and we know that you are no one who would cheat us." How is this? I mean, the fact that we're all sitting here suspicious that Odysseus is even telling the truth on his retelling, right? And then the King Alcinous. But I don't know. I'm not convinced that sometimes I find King Alcinous to be a bit dull, or maybe not in his speech, but in his mind, right? A bit blunt. He seems to be slow to act. But he does have some cleverness when he's first introduced to Odysseus, some back and forth about Nausicaa. So I don't know. He's an interesting character for me. Or is he being tongue-in-cheek here, like he was when... what was that guy's name? Broadsea? Remember in Broadsea? He disrespects Odysseus, and King Alcinous is like, "Oh, it's okay. We know you're not upset, but this youngster that gets underneath your skin." Like there's just like this little dig at him. So I don't know if this is another one where King Alcinous is somewhat like, "Yeah, you actually do look like someone who would cheat us, and you're telling a story tailored to us to get more gifts from us."
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of the latter, but the way well, maybe not all the latter. It's almost like one of these jokes where you go like, "I see what you did there," right? He's not even. I guess what I'm getting at is there might even be a general appreciation for someone who has told their tale well, even though they're spinning it in a certain sense. Like, again, maybe just in the sense of crafting the version. You told that story, you read the audience perfectly, and you told it just the way we'd want to hear it. And I noticed that, right? Like, and I'm very subtly going to say, to call that out.
Okay, I'm going to argue against myself here, because something just occurred to me. So we have this train of or grand array of women. The front bookend is his mother. Then we have this break in the narrative, which is broke by Odysseus pauses, but then we are introduced immediately to Queen Arete. So we have another female figure. But then look how this pause ends. The last line of the pause is thanks to a vicious woman's will. It ends with another reference to a woman, which is who is this that he's talking about?
Oh, Clytemnestra.
Is
Right?
it?
Yeah, because this segues into the Agamemnon.
But he wouldn't know about. Oh yeah, he would.
That's-
Here he's telling his story to King Alcinous, so he knows it already.
Yeah, so Odysseus is carrying on at that point. So the man of countless exploits carried on.
Oh yeah, who escaped? Yeah, so he's setting. I see. No, you're exactly right. So he's setting up the narrative for Agamemnon, and so the vicious woman here is Agamemnon's wife. So that's interesting that then it ends with this reference to a vicious woman who, I mean, wouldn't that then be the contrast, Thomas, to everything that you just mentioned?
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on. One, I think he does pause the story here, right? He stops, and Alcinous asks him to go on. And what is Alcinous most interested in? What is his minstrel always singing about? He wants to know about Troy. Troy is, I mean, so we're almost having a switch in narratives as well. You just gave the story that was most of interest to Arete. Now Alcinous is asking for the story, and what does Alcinous want to hear about? He wants to hear about Troy. And so I think that's interesting in itself. I mean, I think that more or less explains it. I also think, by the way, the comments, the footnote on mine says that the woman is ambiguous as to the exact, is that Clytemnestra, or is it talking about Helen overall, as if Helen brought all these men to their fate in some way or other? Because it's
I
plural.
guess you're right. I guess that is Helen. I guess that would be Helen. Yeah, not Clytemnestra.
Yeah, because it's a plural. They died on the way home through a
Right.
wicked woman's will. Like,
That's
who,
right.
though? Right? Yeah.
I stand corrected.
Well, I'm not sure that. Well, I'm going to go with the comment that it is ambiguous. Like I could take that as either one.
Well, it's a they for Agamemnon's wife too, right? Because I think this, when I first read it, I thought it applied to Helen, but if you read it right, so in the Fagles, it says the grief of my comrades dead in the war's wake, who escaped the battle cries of Trojan armies, only to die in blood at the journey's end.
Oh, thanks to a vicious woman's will.
Vicious woman's will. So
that sounds very Clytemnestra-like.
Yeah. So I think that it could apply to Helen overall, but I actually think, Dr. Grabowski, that your read is correct.
Okay.
Particularly because then you're shifting immediately into the Agamemnon narrative.
Right.
Right.
Well,
and remember that she doesn't kill just Agamemnon. The they there is that she also slaughters all of his men.
Well, I think there's also a sense in which the ambiguity that, like I said, that at least is mentioned in the footnote here, is not necessarily a bad thing, because I think when you run through the Agamemnon narrative, you actually have three women are either explicitly mentioned or implicitly set up as the point of this story, because you have Clytemnestra, Helen, and Penelope, all mentioned throughout the Agamemnon narrative. Well, and Cassandra, but we'll put Cassandra to one side at the moment. And I mean, they're set up as types, right? There you have. Well, we'll get it. Well, let's wait. Let's wait for the story.
Well, why don't you just go ahead and lead us, Thomas, into this? I mean, we've kind of seen this narrative before. So, is there anything we need to note here about how it's presented in this text? And do we get any details? I mean, what would you pick out of it?
That's a good question. So, we went over this before, and assuming that the previous narrative makes it through the editor okay, because I had a microphone malfunction that caused it to garble. But the idea is, we'll give the quick backstory that Agamemnon comes home with Cassandra, is dined and royally welcomed by his wife, only to then discover that his wife has been having an affair with Aegisthus, and both are in fact planning his murder. And he is killed either at the feast or shortly thereafter, depending on which narrative you take. And there's a whole lot of various versions of this that are that ultimately get in play form. But in within the context of this story, his anger here is really unbounded, right? That he says that this treacherous Clytemnestra has has murdered, and that she stained all of womankind by her action, right? I mean, it has no scope whatsoever. He's basically saying that the time of faithful wives is no more. He also has no self-awareness. Like he's talking about how the time of faithful wives is no more. She even killed my mistress. I mean, that there's absolutely zero self-reflection in Agamemnon, and I think this is actually something Homer's doing on purpose. Within the culture, one has to admit that faithfulness is not considered the same for men and women. So we just have to understand that. But I still think there's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek thing going on here of something that Agamemnon, through his own failings, has brought this on himself and still does not realize it. And I think that is going to play out through all of the people we see, all of the Achaeans we see in Hades, being contrasted to Odysseus. That Odysseus is alive. He's the true hero that, like Heracles, can go down to Hades and return. These heroes have failed in part. They're like little h instead of capital H heroes. They have, in some real sense, brought themselves to Hades. They have put themselves here while he is transcendent over that in some real sense. So I think there's two contrasts being played out. That they brought this on themselves in some real way.
Yeah, and what occurs to me here too is that how much the narrative on the feminine continues. So when you were talking about that grand array of women, I had forgotten that Agamemnon makes these large universal comments on the whole breed of womankind. So it's very interesting that we kind of saw a lot of these women who actually are glorious women, right? These wonderful women. And then it transitions to Queen Arete, then to Agamemnon's wife, and then Agamemnon starts giving this narrative on women as a whole. And I do think that, I mean, the one thing I think from kind of our main narrative to take away from this is how much I think this actually does affect Odysseus, right? How much this actually affects him when he returns back to Ithaca.
Yeah, it does. And I think what you see here too, this is interesting in Agamemnon's take, is that even Agamemnon flinches slightly. So he goes into this speech about basically how faithless all women are. You can never trust them. Then he has a probably quite famous sort of discursion here where he says, never go easy with your wife. Never tell her every thought you have in your head. Tell her some only, keep the rest well hidden. But then he starts talking about Penelope, and he actually kind of switches a little bit. He said, not that Penelope would ever be like this. Right? There's an interesting notion which even Agamemnon realizes, that Penelope is different.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this question of mind is coming up again, because the first thing he's saying is never share your mind with her. Never share your mind with your wife. Keep your thoughts hidden. And this is exactly the opposite of the relationship that Odysseus and Penelope actually have. And this is not part of the advice that Odysseus takes. In fact, we know that when he does meet Penelope after things are reconciled, he tells her the whole story, which is he opens his whole mind to her. So he does not follow this.
He almost tells her the whole story. Right.
But one part of his advice that he does take, of course, is that he says, okay, you know what? Maybe you should come back in secret. There's a sense of restraint here that Agamemnon is saying that if he has any hint of self-awareness, he realizes that his pride had perhaps outstripped him. And also remember, we're talking about this idea of homecoming as being part of the idea of Kleos, part of the idea of glory. Well, what happened to Agamemnon's Kleos? All everybody's ever going to remember Agamemnon for is not the fall of Troy. It's for him getting murdered by his wife that was cheating on him.
Right.
His Kleos has been reduced to nothing, and it also shows, I think, how fragile Kleos is. I think that's part of the narrative. You thought you had all this glory, But where was it really?
What do you think about in like 525 or so, Agamemnon asking about Orestes, his son?
I think this is key, and in fact, in the Greek, it's interesting because I think this is come with Achilles in a minute as well. That ultimately you have this shift towards family, right? Ultimately, what is it that Agamemnon wants to know about? All of his anger having been vented, and he seems to be the original. By the way, I think Agamemnon also proves that this current and this sort of ridiculous red pill phenomenon is not new. I think Agamemnon's sort of the original, but the last word that he says in the Greek is Orestes. Homer has delayed him speaking his name so that it can be the very last word that comes out of his mouth. And one, I think that foreshadows, of course, what we know Orestes will do to avenge his father. But two, I think it's ultimately this shift. What do I really want to know about? I want to know about my son. And the worst thing that she did is essentially what he's saying is the worst thing she did was to rob me of the sight of my son.
Well, let's use that as a segue to push into what I think is probably the most fascinating narrative of the entire book, because it's a commentary on the Iliad, which is his dialogue with Achilles. So let me kind of show you what I'll just kind of play my cards and how I took this. So Achilles and them is going back and forth. It's interesting that, he calls him the man of tactics, right? My restless friend. We've talked about, I think, on previous podcasts, that the interim period between the Iliad and the Odyssey really had a theme of placing Achilles and Odysseus as contraries. Achilles really was that thumos, the glory, but really the rage, the violence, the power, right? And that failed to take Troy. It did. Achilles died outside the walls of Troy, right? It failed to take Troy. Meanwhile, the cleverness, right? The wit, the intellect of Odysseus saves them time and time again. If you read those narratives from the interim period, and we actually have a whole podcast just on those narratives, it's almost comical how it's just, okay, now there's a problem, Odysseus fixes it. Now there's another problem, Odysseus fixes it. And so, we've seen the bards sing of, these antagonisms between Achilles and Odysseus, which really, I think, in a lot of ways is between this thumos, this arete, if you will, this excellence in military combat, compared to maybe an arete of the mind, which I think is where Homer the teacher might be challenging his audience to a certain degree. So Achilles comes out and Odysseus praises him, right? There's not a man in the world more blessed than you. And Achilles' response to this is almost just earth-shattering. I mean, for all of us who have been reading along this whole time, Achilles responds, "No winning words about death to me, shining Odysseus. By God, I'd rather be a slave on earth for another man, some dirt-poor tenant farmer who scrapes to keep alive, than rule down here over all the breathless dead." I mean, is he not? So let's be blunt. Does he not show that he made the wrong choice? Did he make the wrong choice? Is that what he's telling us? That dying for glory and this immortal glory for my name was the wrong choice.
I would give all that up. Buyer's remorse, yeah.
Yeah, I would give all that up to still be alive like you. I would rather go be a poor tenant farmer, which then has no glory at all. But I would rather just be alive. I mean, is he showing us that he made the wrong choice?
I think yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the contrast here is trying to. This is the shift, right? It's away from Kleos, and it's towards some other notion. I think that still remains to be fleshed out, although we're getting hints as to what it means to be a man. And it's more than glory.
Yeah, it's more than prowess in war, right? That was one of the questions. Like when we deal with arete, then this excellence, that's a major question of the Iliad. But the contrast there in the Iliad is between Achilles and Hector. And I think that, we argued that, Homer the teacher is showing us that really arete is something more, something that actually Hector embodies more than Achilles does. And so here, I think we show buyer's remorse. I think this is also then the analog here is that It's a failure showing the shortcoming of an arete that is focused just simply on power.
Well, I think
Odysseus, go ahead.
Well, there's a twofold kind of thing going on here too, right? So one, his Kleos has already been shown up, right? His line, he says, "What greater deed, rash man, wilt thou plan next?" Is what Achilles, one of the translations for what Achilles says to Odysseus. Like, well, he's basically acknowledging, well, what you're just doing now, journeying into Hades like Heracles, is greater than anything I ever did. And he also doesn't even say, what will you do next? He says, what will you plan next? Which is this interesting idea, too, of Odysseus, this planner, this schemer type thing. But it's already showing that Achilles even recognizes that at the level of achievement or of deed, Odysseus has triumphed. And I think we're going to see that with Ajax, brought home with Ajax in just a minute. But ultimately, I think it's also in what Achilles does next, which is to ask about his son. Right?
Right.
We're back. Yeah.
And I would just add one thing, too.
See that pattern again. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just add one thing, too. As we're thinking about this shift from Kleos to something else, I think it's really a shift from what they took as being extrinsically valuable to something that is intrinsically valuable. It's the emergence of the self. It's the emergence of, however you want to cash this out, the individual. There's something within ourselves that transcends mere guest gifts, mere the booty that one happens to acquire through war. Because what is Kleos? Kleos is always cashed out in terms of what you have, the armor that you strip off the body of the soldier that you've killed on the battlefield. And I think that this is a complete and utter repudiation that where value lies is in the stuff that you have, the stuff that you gain, the concubines that you collect, and that it has something a lot more to do with who you are as an individual. So,
well, I think that's a fantastic, brilliant point, because there's some sense here that you take yourself, some level of the self survives to go on in Hades. But what more battles does Achilles have to fight? What more enemies does he have to conquer? He perfected himself in one thing that is entirely useless to him where he is now. And as he looks towards his son, he does ask whether or not his son has done well in battle, how he's acquitted himself. You could think about that in a sense of just like him wanting glory for his son. But I think there's something deeper in that. I think he's really just asking if his son is doing well. And there's some sense as well in which there's a vicariousness. He's trying to live through his son.
Absolutely.
In some real sense. And in immortality.
Because the story that Odysseus tells is that of this sort of glorious warrior, a man who earned basically no battle scars because he was so virtuous on the battlefield.
Well, isn't that though, that is the exemplar of the life that he chose not to have, right? So now he's most interested in his progeny. He's most interested in his family and their success, which is the exact life that he, rejected. Because this is a lot of this in a lot of ways is an antecedent to Plato's Symposium and understanding how different parts of the soul seek immortality. And the more I read this, the more I realize how indebted Plato is to Homer. And I think right here you're seeing this heavily, that lowest part of Eros is seeking then immortality through children, right? That's how they live on. And it's really interesting then here in Hades, or the house of the dead, that both Agamemnon and Achilles, these great warriors, are now most interested in, but what are my sons doing, right? What is my son doing?
Well, and I think there's one aspect that I should have, because I agree it's mostly about the sons. I think there's something touching, though, just to throw this out, about Achilles asking about his father and how he'd give us all up for another hour with his father. So there, I don't know what to make of that in the broader scheme. I just think there's something incredibly sort of human and touching in his affection for his father as well.
I agree.
But it's true. It's interesting that basically he just when he hears this about his son, he just goes away, basically skipping through the flowers, which are, I'm only making that, it literally, the
He did.
asphodelis.
Oh,
Yeah,
as he
Yeah.
leaves the scene, as Achilles leaves, he's
Yeah,
Yeah.
like
striding.
walking
Yeah,
with long strides across the fields of asphodel.
he's a
yeah.
proud
So
pappy.
yeah, I mean, that's it's an interesting vision. He doesn't really. There's nothing more he needs to hear. Um, and it might be something that you said, Dr. Grabowski, about how he meets everybody where they are.
Mm-hmm.
It might be that he described. Okay, Achilles might have had the opportunity to develop his soul in other ways, but he only developed his soul really in one way. And what the excellences that Odysseus describes in the son are maybe simply the ones that the father would understand. Right? He's a great warrior. Everybody likes him. He's good at counsel. Everybody wants to hear what he has to say. Is that all there is to Neoptolemus? Maybe not. But it's maybe all that Achilles would understand.
Exactly. This is what Achilles wants to hear.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think that's why it's in such stark contrast with Odysseus's response to Agamemnon when asking about Orestes, which is to say, "Why don't ask me? I don't know." It's this very curt response when compared to this sort of glorious hagiographic story that he tells about Neoptolemus.
All right, let's look at the narrative with Ajax. I want to particularly kind of call to mind the myth. So, like, what happened to Ajax? Why did he commit suicide? So he's the second suicide that we see in this book. So if you recall, Achilles dies. We have his armor. They're going to give his armor to someone. They want to give it to the greatest warrior of the Achaeans. There is a blind secret ballot, if you will, and the Achaeans pick Odysseus and not Ajax. I think this goes into that narrative too of the contrast that we've been talking about with Achilles and Odysseus, right? Like this is the arete of the mind is being focused here. I don't think it's arete as a whole, which I think I would see much more in like someone like Hector, but we're seeing like an emphasis on the excellence of cleverness, of the intellect over just sheer, military prowess, if you will. So Ajax, and I think as we've explained, it's not just, oh, I didn't get picked. It's not just I lacked an honor, but rather I've been dishonored. And so he becomes enraged. He's going to kill and slaughter his own men. The gods perplex him, I guess, and he confuses the sheep for Achaeans, and he goes off and kills a bunch of sheep, thinking he's slaughtering his countrymen, finds a nice big ram, takes it to his tent, ties it to a pole, and is beating it to death, thinking it's Odysseus. And then they take the blinders off him. He sees what he's done. Now he's a shame also in the eyes of the gods, and now he's gone through this humiliation. And so he kills himself. He's a suicide. And they, if I recall correctly, they simply bury him in the earth. Right? There's no burning. There's no funeral pyre. He is simply buried in the earth. And so here we see what I think maybe a lot of readers might have been hoping for was some type of reconciliation between Odysseus and Ajax. And we see that the blazing anger still very much burns with Ajax. And to Odysseus' credit, I think, he cries out to him, trying to win him over, right? He tries to use his rhetoric, but it doesn't work, right? Ajax answered not a word. Any thoughts on the Ajax narrative?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that are interesting. One, if you think about the way that glory has been portrayed, it's not obvious why up until this point a kind of forgiveness and reconciliation would have been admirable in the Greek culture. He might have as well just have gone over and said, well, I guess which of us was the better after all? Which of us is still alive? Haha. That's not what he does. I mean, and it's not that's portrayed as a bad. Odysseus is portrayed as the bigger man and the better man, and it's shown that he's the better man precisely in not holding a grudge and offering forgiveness and reconciliation. And I think that's a cultural shift as well as it is a it set out before us as a good example.
I
But it
agree
also
with you,
contrasts
Thomas.
Ajax, right?
I agree
Like
with you, Thomas.
Ajax is shown to be the smaller man.
Yeah, there is the strange thing that Odysseus says at the end, where he says, "Yet now, despite his anger," that's Ajax, "he might have spoken to me or I to him, but the heart inside me stirred with some desire to see other ghosts." So it's like,
Yeah, it's weird.
Ajax stomps off, he blends in with the other shades. That could have been an invitation for Odysseus to pursue Ajax, to say, "Come on, guy, let's hug it out. Let's iron out our wrinkles." But Odysseus, I think, maybe inside understands that it's probably not going to work out. He's holding a grudge, and so I'm going to move on. Not only, looking or interacting with these other shades, but I'm going to move on with my narrative. But I just wonder if, had Odysseus pursued Ajax as Ajax walked away, whether there could have been, as you said, Deacon Harrison, some reconciliation. But I find this, a very sad and disappointing scene that this is what's become of Ajax, the great warrior.
Well, it's also interesting that he doesn't drink the blood, or if he does drink the blood, he doesn't speak. So either he's able to recognize Odysseus without drinking it, or he drank it and then refused to speak. It's probably the latter, which is interesting.
Do you hold there that they have to drink the blood to be able to recognize Odysseus?
Well, his mother didn't recognize him until she drank the blood.
I'm not sure I picked up on that.
Well, I mean, I'm looking too. I mean, I don't think Achilles drinks the blood. I don't think Agamemnon does either.
Well, I think that's just like story
it's very
compression. Like
inconsistent.
he doesn't mention it
I'm
every
sorry.
single
Agamemnon
time.
does say he knew me at once as soon as he drank the blood, but I don't think Achilles does.
But it's that he knew me at once he drank the blood. I mean that, and also his Tiresias, when he's talking to Tiresias, he says, how can my mother not just speak, but how can I make her recognize me? Something to that effect. So there seems to be that. So Ajax, it seems, drank the blood because he recognizes Odysseus, and at that point, then refuses to speak.
That's fascinating. So they're actually drawn to the blood. So it's not Odysseus that they're actually drawn. It's not like his mom's actually drawn to him or Tiresias is drawn to him. They're drawn by the blood. And then once they drink it, then they recognize him?
I don't know. His mom was one of the first people there. I think there's at least some sort of like very vague impression that there's some sort of bond, right? That is not necessarily even recognized by them, but is still operative in some real sense. Right, I mind you, I'm completely reading between the lines there. But if you think about his mom coming up right after, right as soon as he gets there, essentially, seems more than random.
Yeah, I'd like to go back and explore that more. So the book ends, book 11 ends with kind of a series of mythological characters. We get King Minos, he's the judge. And we'll actually see him pop back up in Dante's Inferno in a really kind of prominent way. Orion, several others. Sisyphus, which is always kind of a fun character, right? He's the guy that's rolling the boulder up the hill, only for it to roll back down the hill, and then he does this for all eternity. Albert Camus made him somewhat famous in his existential writings, if anyone's familiar with him. I think that's how I was first introduced to that myth. Because Sisyphus was always like this very clever king that could even outwit the gods. And so now for all eternity, he has to do this incredibly mundane, demeaning task over and over again that actually requires no wit. So it's actually an incredibly fitting. But then we get, I love this. This was to me, this is another very Dantean thing. So Heracles then sees Odysseus. And Odysseus says, Heracles knew me at once, at first glance. And then Hercules basically says, oh yeah, here are all my labors, right, and grand adventures I had. And, we're pretty much just the same. This is what you're doing too. So Odysseus tells a story basically like, hey, I saw what is arguably like the most heroic character in all of Greek mythology, and we were basically buds, right? He basically said like, hey, you're like on the same path that I was. And this made me really laugh because like if you're familiar with Dante's Inferno, Dante does almost the exact same thing when he goes down into limbo and sees all the other poets, these great poets, right? Like Homer, and they all circle around him and recognize him as like an equal, right? That's what I feel like is happening here with this narrative with Hercules. So I found this like very comical, and you have to imagine what this is like telling this in King Alcinous's court, right? So then I saw this man, and he knew me, right? My fame has already gone down even into the underworld, and he knew me. I find it as very comical.
Well, and that Heracles is the absolute. Uh, there is no higher Greek hero, no higher possible Greek hero. And there's, he's seeing an analogy here between their labors, but also the analogy, of course, into venturing into Hades. Although Odysseus only goes to the border of Hades, so that might be an interesting, like, slight contrast there, because Heracles goes in.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, this is to us, all these Greek heroes kind of run into one another. So we're like, is Achilles really that much more famous? Well, to them, Heracles is the top. And he's like, oh yeah, you and me, Odysseus, was like this.
Yeah, I just thought it'd be really funny, particularly if you think of in mind like the court, right? This like feast that he's giving this talk to, and like how that would actually be received. Anyway,
Well, could I
other?
just ask one quick question
Yeah,
before?
of course.
Yeah, and it's sort of this interesting, almost metaphysical statement that Homer is making, or Odysseus is making, at the beginning, where he says that he catches a glimpse of his ghost.
Oh yeah.
In the Greek, it's literally his phantom, but the man himself delights in the grand feasts. So it's like there's, who's he really meeting? He's not meeting Hercules. He's meeting, or he sees an image or a reflection. Because the word in the Greek is it's eidos, or eidolon, which is like a phantom or an image or a reflection or something like that. So this isn't the pasuke. It's not the soul, because all of the other shades that he meets in hell are pasukai. They're souls. So this is not the soul of Heracles or Hercules. This is a phantom, an image of the man who still lives up on Mount Olympus, or with the gods. So I was just wondering, what do you think Homer is trying to tell us here about human nature? Or is he making some grand statement here about? Go ahead, Thomas.
I think maybe, but we've got to back up, because I think we got to go back to Minos, right? So he sees first, but up until Minos, we don't have any notion of Hades being much of a place of judgment, unless you look at a kind of progression where you have first Tiresias and this, but by the time you get to Agamemnon, there's an idea that they've placed themselves here, like they're here through their own fault in some real sense. But by Minos, now we have an actual judgment of behavior, in which you then have Orion and these others that have in some way transgressed against the gods, right? They've reached out towards immortality in some way or other. Either Sisyphus, who knew secrets of the gods and then betrayed them, or Orion and these others who went after goddesses. Again, this kind of idea of a transgression of the natural boundary between mortal and immortal. And now they're being judged for it in some real way. Well, Heracles is the man that becomes immortal. And you have this kind of interesting idea, I think, if you want to have a metaphysical scheme that Homer might be trying to do, is it's just there's a kind of bilocation going on, where he is a man, and so there's some sense of him that on death belongs in Hades, but he, through his suffering and through his labors, so unlike Orion or these others that reached out after immortality as something to be taken, he, through his suffering and through his labors, achieves immortality and lives in some ways on two dimensions, on two planes, yes, there's this kind of reflection of him in Hades, but the true hero has gone up to
Well,
Olympus.
and I can't help. I mean, you're right, and what this evokes to me are the Platonic forms, where you effectively have the ideal up in Platonic heaven, and the way that Socrates in the dialogues often describes the physical objects as being a reflection or being a copy.
Right.
They're not real. I mean, this brings to mind, of course, the allegory of the cave with the images that are flittering on the wall, and so this what Odysseus effectively meets in Hades are these images that are flickering on the wall. All the while, the real Heracles is up partying in on Mount Olympus.
Well, I think there's a twofold thing that goes with that as well. One is there's a kind of I mean maybe Deacon I would know much better than I because I haven't read Tiresias, but I believe Dante has a similar sort of split where the souls are in the planets or and beholding. So there's this kind of
Yeah, I was gonna.
bilocation. Yeah.
No, you read my mind. I was gonna say, well, and a lot of people though would say that this is not Dante making to borrow your term, Dr. Grabowski, a metaphysical claim or a spiritual claim, but that Dante ran into a poetical problem, right? Which is, well, everyone in heaven is actually enjoying the beatific vision. So how do you show gradation, or how do you have a journey up through heaven if everyone is at the same place enjoying the beatific vision? Now, that doesn't mean they have the same capacity or other things, but Dante had to come up with some kind of narrative scheme to show this. So Dante, what Thomas is talking about, which I think is spot on, because that's what I was thinking about, is that when he gets to like the moon, which is like the lowest one, there are shades there, and they seem to be very far away from where the beatific vision is. And I can't remember exactly what they are. They're ones that I think broke their oaths, their vows, but lived like virtuous lives. But then, and he's kind of climbing through the moon, and he goes through all the planets. But what you find out halfway through is that, well, I'm actually only talking the phantoms. All the souls are actually all in the same place at the top of heaven, all enjoying the beatific vision in the same spot. And so then the whole cascading layers of heaven become this interesting thing where these are just kind of projections. I'm not sure what the best word would be, but it's very similar to this, where the real Heracles is somehow in heaven. Because if I remember right, he's basically assumed up into Mount Olympus, but there's like a shade of him or projection of him down here where he needs to meet Odysseus. And one thing that I would have a question about is that projection of Heracles here all the time? Or is it actually here simply because Odysseus is here? And so this is how he talks to Odysseus, because Odysseus can't come up into Mount Olympus. So, but the higher can go down into the lower, and so then Heracles is down here and talks to him.
Well, I do think there's a second aspect related to that, which is that when Odysseus is comparing, strictly speaking, when Odysseus is saying that Heracles is comparing Odysseus to Heracles, I think the other thing he's implying is that, like me, you are destined for immortality. It's left unstated in a sense, but I still think there's at least a hint at a notion that you too have labored and suffered and, as it were, earned is maybe too strong a term, but opened a way to transcend death. I mean, they both have this. I think that, returning to the drama aspect, this is a compression of drama here, right? Where the ultimate journey or the ultimate adventure that we're talking about is the going out and then the coming home. Well, the taken to its furthest extreme and then compressed down to a single chapter is journeying into death and then returning alive. Heracles does this. Odysseus does this. If you want to go in like more modern fiction, this is always the ultimate kind of adventure. Tolkien has Baron, and then and if we obviously go into the true myth, as the phrase goes, right? Christianity has the ultimate reflection of this, Christ, who. But there is an ultimate difference as well. These go down alive, like a Heracles or an Odysseus, go down alive and essentially don't belong there. In the true myth, you have someone who actually triumphs over death. Christ can't be contained by death. He can actually enter into it. Where, as we see here, even with Odysseus, there are deeper hells that he's not willing to go to, in fact, not even willing to look at, and flees from when he fears they're near.
Nope, very good. Well, I appreciate it, gentlemen. I think that was a wonderful kind of journey and explanation and parsing out of Book 11. I think that's a book that's really grown on me. I don't know why. The first time I read it, it didn't stick too much, but as I've kind of reread and talked about it in the groups, I think it's really kind of blossomed into, I think, yeah, Thomas, like you said, I think one of the most interesting books in the entirety of the Odyssey. So thank you guys again. I really appreciate it. Everyone can go on Ascend, thegreatbookspodcast.com, or just thegreatbookspodcast.com, and check out our guide. And then I think Adam and I will be leading us through book 12 next week, The Cattle of the Sun. So thank you guys.
Thanks.